Well, and plus, like, the idea of it now is very different from the idea of when it was, like, started. Like, you know, it was a social network that allowed, like, for me, it was about keeping in touch with family. And now it's become, like, a tool for people to market to. And you know, like, including my friends and family. and it's like, I don't really want that, you know? Like, I just post a few pictures of my kids, so, you know, my parents who are 4 hours away can see them. Anyhow.
Sorry if I get in your shot, by the way. I'm not trying to.
Czop is an analyst at Abacus Data. He's worked on a wide variety of projects with corporations, NGOs, and charities. He also supports the development of research content that has been cited in the Claims, the National Post, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, Huffington Post, and High Politics. Most recently, Maciej led the study commissioned by TAG about public perceptions of access to justice in Ontario. Avvy is the clinic director of Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Committee. Since her call to the bar in 1991, she has worked exclusively in the legal clinic system, serving the legal needs of low-income individuals and families, the majority of whom are non-English-speaking immigrants and refugees. Avvy is a bencher of the Law Society of Upper Canada, where she serves on the Access to Justice Committee, the Equity and Aboriginal Issues Committee, and the Human Rights Monitoring Group. Avvy has received many awards for her access to justice work, including the Order of Ontario in 2014. And to my left is Farrah, a nationally recognized counselor, educator, and artist with over 60 years of experience addressing gender-based violence. She is the Sexual Violence Support and Education Coordinator at Ryerson University. Farrah has co-created innovative, community-centered initiatives, conducted trainings across North America on gender-based violence, and developed a risk assessment safety planning tool on forced marriage. She's the co-chair of the Ontario Roundtable on Violence Against Women and has been appointed to the Government of Canada's Federal Strategy Against Gender-Based Violence Advisory Council. Thanks, everyone. Here. So I've got a few questions here, and then we'll just work our way back in. So we'll start with you, Maciej. Why is public consultation on complex social issues helpful?
I think it's helpful. Sorry. It's helpful to get public buy-in, and you can't get the public to buy into improving access for marginalized groups when most feel they can't effectively access the system, as the study we did showed. So to create empathy, interaction, people need to feel they have it better than others, and it just doesn't seem to be the case with access to justice.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I guess, can I just roll back a little bit, because my first question is, when I was looking at the topic for today, is who are the public that we're talking about? And from my perspective, because I work in a legal clinic, and the clients we serve are very marginalized, low income, some of them without status, and even those who are citizens or immigrants, they still feel or experience a lot of issues, systemic such as poverty, racism, discrimination in the workplace, and so on. So I guess when we are talking about access to justice from the public perspective, I think we need to be clear about which particular segment of the public that we're talking about. And so my interest is on the particular segment of the public who face a lot of systemic issues. So when you talk about public consultation, and of course it's important for government to hear from the people who are directly affected by policies before they formulate a policy, and to understand the lived experiences of those individuals in order to understand the impact of the policy on these communities. And certainly I would say that public consultation is crucial for any policy making. But at the same time, we also know that there are many social issues that have been around for a long, long time, right? Take the example of workers' rights issues. We've been working on a report called the Sweet and Sour Report that talks about Chinese restaurant workers. But this is, the working conditions that they experience, but this is nothing new, right? So we're actually repeating a report that was done 30 years ago. And certainly over the last 30 years, there have been a number of public consultations on this kind of issue. So to me, almost like the public consultations sometimes is used as a way of derail social movement, or to kind of, as a way of not dealing with the issues, but then just continue to consult the public on an issue that you know the solution, you know what the solution is, but there's no political will to implement the solution. So I think we need to distinguish public consultations that are real consultations leading to solutions, as opposed to public consultations that are really just there for the show.
I'm too short for even this. So yes, thank you again for having me, and I think everything that Avvy said really resonates with me. I think as someone who sits as a marginalized person on multiple different identities, oftentimes we are consulted to death, it feels like, consistently being asked, what do you need? What would make it safer for you to come forward? I'm speaking specifically about sexual assault survivors. And I think one of the things we really need people to do is follow up on the promises were made in the past 10 other consultations that we gave, and really hear how those need to be implemented and what that information looks like. I think too often times we do get consulted, and what comes out of that is, okay, we'll have more education and we'll do more consultation. And I would like even further from that action that actually is about addressing systemic problems that really affect the most marginalized communities. And I'll give you one example about access to justice. When I was thinking about this, one of the most salient cases that sits within my heart around this issue of sexual violence and access to justice is the story of Ines, who was a woman who for 7 years fought to be able to testify in a sexual assault case against her uncle and cousin and wear the niqab. To me, this is one of the biggest feminist issues that we've seen, and this is still an issue where she was not able to testify wearing the niqab. So here we have a woman that was not able to access justice. And even I would like to question the word justice, because I think it's a legal system to me, not really a justice system at this time. It's like your American Idol moment. I think what's at stake is what we saw. I think people, and I'm going to talk about sexual violence, and I'm going to be really real. I'm not a lawyer, so please stop me if I'm saying something that steps off of that. But I think what we saw in the past year says a lot. We know that less than 10% of survivors of sexual violence report to the police. We know out of that, even a smaller amount, those cases go to trial. We know that so many survivors, when they talk about sexual assault, they talk about that secondary victimization from institutions. That idea of institutional betrayal, where the institutions are supposed to have justice for them. And not even saying that, find always the person that they're accused of causing harm to be found causing harm, but even to have a system that upholds their safety and rights. And I think we saw this in Justice Robert Camp, the comments that he made in court towards an Indigenous woman. We see this in times where survivors, when they're listening to this, I would say survivors were always listening. We hear you when you blame us in court. We hear you when you shut down us from actually accessing justice. We hear you when you say that somehow that survivor was asking for it by posting those pictures. And what it tells us is to not come forward and say something, to not get the support that we need, to not say that they were sexually assaulted and they want the support in terms of our court system, in terms of our legal system, and in terms of even talking about it, even talking about sexual assault. So it has a chilling effect, and it has an effect too where the most marginalized people are the ones that are not accessing that system.
I agree, and I also think that what's at stake is that ultimately our legal system as a whole is at stake and our democracy is at stake. When people feel that they are not getting justice from the so-called justice system, they will lose faith in the system, and the system itself will lose legitimacy at the end of the day. Again, I'll use this example. So we survey 184 restaurant workers of Chinese descent based on their experiences having worked in a restaurant, how many of them have not been paid overtime pay, minimum wage, and so on and so forth. And of course, we find that 43% have never been paid minimum wage, have not been paid minimum wage. A large portion of them were never been paid overtime pay, vacation pay, and so on and so forth. But what is striking about it is that only a very small percentage of them have actually used the system to file a claim against their employers. And of those small percentage, only about 8% of the total surveyed actually got something at the end of the day. The vast majority have never filed a claim because they don't think it is going to help them. And in fact, it has not helped those who have filed a claim. So I think when we talk about access to justice, I think we need to talk about access to substantive justice. And it's not enough to talk about access to, let's say, legal information or even legal services, because a lot of these people were clients of our clinic, and we have helped them file a claim. We were successful with the claim. We got the Ministry of Labor order, and still at the end of the day, the clients were not able to collect the money. So we need to look at the substance of the system, both in terms of the content of the law, but also the implementation of the law, and ultimately to assess how legitimate that system is.
I think from a public opinion perspective, which is why I'm here, I can speak to what you're both talking about, but from the Abacus data perspective, what's at stake, the best case scenario is apathy, and the worst case scenario is pushback, which you definitely don't want. And we think that the challenge for TAG is that lawyers you can see them as the administrators and the gatekeepers to the system that we have. And the system is meant to serve the public good, but it's highly privatized. And unlike other institutions in Canada, like education, health, in those systems, those who can't pay or who can't have those charges covered elsewhere still can receive good services, good outcomes. But with justice, this is trickier. Those with money and those with knowledge have significant advantage when accessing the system. And add to that how rarely most of us interact with the justice system. When I say most of us, I mean the general public. So we think that the sector needs to constantly engage with the public, talk about what they do, how it's important for society, because social problems are made worse by poor access and failures within the justice system.
I really want to pick up on that piece of just like the whole access piece, or just this idea is that we want to have safer communities. We want to have communities where people feel that they can speak out, that they can get safety. And I think what makes me nervous about this and what makes me saddened is when I have survivors in my office that say to me, what's the point? What's the point if I say something? And that is deeply disturbing to me to know that that they feel like it is part of almost that they have to live through violence in a way because there's no really any recourse. And we don't want to give that message, and that's the message right now that we're hearing time and time again from survivors. And when I speak about survivors, I'm not talking just about cis women. I'm talking about trans folks that come to my office, gender non-binary people that come to my office that consistently don't see themselves reflected even in the conversations that we're having. And then when they do go to the police or when they go to the criminal justice system, they feel like that their bodies are not included even in what deserves to feel safe. Or we see them be blamed or shamed. Too oftentimes they themselves are not given the informed consent to even how the system works, and I think that's a big piece. And I know access to justice is about education, but when we have survivors that are not clear about that process, and even those that are advocates, we are not clear because the system sometimes, we feel like we know it, and then things shift and change, or we feel like it's not actually being done the way it's supposed to, which I think is another piece. This is a challenge for us, and I think too often we're seeing people feel like they don't have faith in a system that I love that Avvy said this piece around, that actually is about diminishing our democracy. Like if we don't have people having access to this, what is the point?
So, for your comments about how such a huge portion of the population, or it doesn't really matter how many, but that people don't feel represented by the system, it's meant to be for the public that alienation, disengagement is there. So how can we better link the law with life circumstances, with real life, with experiences that are the reality that people facing communities about? How can we strengthen that?
So I think that so it's a question of how can we improve the law so that it actually has a positive impact on people's lives. I think that's sort of the goal that we're working towards. And I think we need to start by acknowledging that our society is not equal in the sense that there are segments in the society they are very privileged, and then there are segments of our population that are very disadvantaged. So they experience laws differently, and law has different meaning and relevance to them. And so if we want the law to, from my point of view, I think we should focus on those individuals who are most likely to be negatively impacted by the law. Because if you're privileged, chances are the law doesn't really have the same relevance to you, right? You know, just take an example, the minimum wage law. Unless you live on minimum wage, it doesn't really mean anything to you. If you are the 1% or even the top 10% of the population, it doesn't matter to you what the minimum wage is. So I think we need to focus on those who are the most disadvantaged or most vulnerable and talk about how the law can be improved to reduce or eliminate the barriers to equality or to equity. And so looking at how the laws can be made more in compliance with the Charter or the various international human rights treaties, how the system can be improved to remove barriers to access to justice in a substantive way as well as procedural ways. And sort of looking from the lens of those who are most likely to be negatively affected by it.
I want to respond to that because some of our research that we did, people don't realize how vulnerable they are. They don't understand they're in the vulnerable group. Well, you don't have to be disenfranchised in a marginalized group. You can be in a lower middle class and be teetering on the edge of a legal cesspool, a situation where you wouldn't be able to get out of it. Basically, about 3 in 10 Canadians we found were in a risky situation if they ever had a legal issue. So I think I just wanted to play off your point a little bit there.
I think one of the promising things with this that we can say is that when survivors have asked, one of the things that survivors have asked for is having their own legal representation when they are going through the system around sexual violence. We're seeing that the pilot project that's coming out of the Ontario government, It's Never Okay Action Plan to End Sexual Violence, having a pilot project where survivors can access a lawyer even before they report to the police. And I want to see what that data will look like after a year or 2 of that, to see what that looks like. And I think more pilot projects like that, where people can get access to legal support, understand, that's an access justice piece, to understand what does it mean if I report? How many years will this take? What will they look at? Will they look at my emails? Will they look at my Instagram photos? Will they look at my social media? What will the impact on my family? What will that mean for me? And I think having those kind of pieces in place and really clearly laid out, and also one-on-one individual, because sometimes reading things on the web, and I know OWJN is great, and so is Clio, and those websites we use a lot with our survivors, but actually also having things that people can physically see someone and talk to them about it makes such a difference. So things like that are making changes, but I still think there's so much more to do.
So earlier this morning we had a panel that talked about disruption and how the whole landscape is changing, and what are some lessons that we can learn from other sectors around improving access, or changing the way we work, or changing professional cultures. So with that in mind, what do experts have to gain from listening to this?
I'm the expert on this. Well, Sabrina, we were talking about this over the phone a little while ago, the medical profession. And we've worked with pharmacists and paramedics, and it's really eye-opening to them to see what people, or how people perceive their profession, what they think they actually do versus what the reality is. And I think it's important because then you can align all your ships in the same direction. You want the public and your association and the professionals all sailing in the same direction. Otherwise it just makes things a lot more difficult than it has to be.
So I guess I'm not the expert here, so I don't know much about public opinion. And I also agree totally that I think public opinion gives us a snapshot of what the public feels, right? It's the perception. And sometimes perception is very important, particularly for like your regulator or institution. They want to know how the public perceive them. And that's very important. But public opinion may not be the best source for all the information, right? Because public opinion can be manipulated. Public opinion can be misinformed. Public opinion can be biased. And it's particularly true for, like, speaking as a minority group member. So public opinion, because it represents a majority view, they are not always in favor of the positions that the minority have. So I remember, for instance, a few days ago I read, well, somehow I got onto the email list of Paul From, and so he was sending email around who was running for the Conservative candidate, leadership candidate. But of course we know that one of the candidates is promoting having some kind of a screening test for immigrants based on their anti-Canadian value. And it's been roundly criticized, I think, from a lot of people. However, the public opinion showed that the majority of Canadians actually agree with her. So, so I think we need to take the public opinion because it tells us where the public is. And we need to respond accordingly, but the response does not always have to be that we go with what the public believes in.
Yes, thank you for bringing up the horrible Canadian values. It's like Canadian values are racist. It's like, and I think that, you know, what Avvy said is really clear, is that when public opinion is based on people with the most power, then they get to shape how people access justice or how we understand what the issues are. And so it's even how the law was not created. It was created by people with a lot of power. It wasn't created by the most marginalized people in Canada. And so that impacts the way who gets to access that justice, who gets to even shape what justice is. One of the biggest questions we always ask survivors when they come to my office is, what does justice look like for you? Because justice can look very different for various people. And so really naming that and giving them a moment to think about what it looks like. And it might not look like going through the legal system. The other piece that I would say with this too is making sure that when we're saying access to justice and making sure that the public opinion piece is that I would love to see around sexual violence, and I know I'm a broken record a little bit, but I would really like to see removing rape culture from our court system, which means thinking about the mythologies that are put inside our court systems that's shame and blame survivors for the sexual assault. We see that too often, and that is oftentimes in the greater public opinion, that survivors are shamed and blamed. And so when we see that we're brought into our courtrooms, we need that to be challenged. And that's one way to actually have survivors feel safer to come forward, and especially the most marginalized. They're oftentimes blamed and shamed for leaving their social location.
I wanted to add, it's a terrible idea to isolate the different actors and the different stakeholders and not have them engage each other. So say the public has an opinion that lawyers don't agree with. I mean, they can sit there and say, okay, well, what does the public know? Or, you know, it can reinvigorate somebody to engage the public more, educate the public more. We're having a conversation, we're not just shouting at each other.
So the results from our study about public perceptions of the justice system that came out this week showed that people don't, a lot of Ontarians, you can remind me of the number, Maciej, one in four, don't think that they have fair and equal access to the justice system. They also use words like intimidating and old-fashioned to describe it, and none of the findings in this study were a surprise to anyone, right? Like this is a problem that we all know already exists.
Sorry, it was 4 and 10.
4 and 10, thank you. 4 and 10, yeah. Let's just digest that for a minute. Don't think that they have fair and equal access to the justice system, so that's surveyed Ontarians. So how do we go about improving the justice system's trust issues with the public?
That is such a complex issue, and you're going to hate me because I have a very simple answer. It's a bit of a cowardly answer, but it's also true. We've found from our experience that just having a conversation and starting a dialogue lets people know that you're listening, and these negative attitudes and these preconceptions they had about who the other side is and what the other side is thinking, they slowly, very slowly, start to disappear. Maybe not entirely, but any progress is great, really.
I think, I guess there are many factors involved, right? So, for instance, first, I know from working with some of the clients, right? So even if let's say we go through the entire process and the result was not something that they had expected. However, if they feel that they have been listened to, and I think that's what the point was being made, if they feel that somebody had listened to them, take their point of view into account, they feel that they had, although they didn't receive the result that they want, but they perceive the process to be fair, right? But then for a lot of the clients where, for other reasons where they are not able to get the substantive result that they want because the system itself is unfair, then I think we need to do a lot more than just educating the public about the system. I think the system itself has to be changed, whether it's for sexual violence victims, whether it's for migrant workers, whether it's for refugees, because it doesn't matter how much you engage them. At the end of the day, if the system is unjust, their perception of the system will not be changed.
That's great. So in terms of what we would like to see, in terms of just a shift and change, like what I think one of the things too is that having worked in a legal clinic and working with lawyers, it's also who even gets to be a part of the legal system. So making sure that our law schools are ensuring that people are in law school are supported that are the most marginalized, making sure that we're checking how we're teaching the law, is that including an understanding of the way anti-oppression operates, how we can actually include anti-racism, how we can include actually an understanding of colonialism in the way we do our education, and also including that in the way that the frameworks occur, because I think the law is one thing, but how it's practiced is another. And if the people that are practicing it don't have an understanding of how social location is impacted and how people access justice, then we have a problem. And I think that's the part of the public perception, is that people that are most marginalized may not feel like they can access this because they don't feel like they're going to be supported when they come forward.
So we have time for a few questions now. There's a mic in the middle here, but you can actually have mine. Oh, we've got mics right there.
So if anybody would like to raise their hand to
I find it very curious that this is a conference about public legal education. And when we do public legal education, we rarely talk to people about how laws come into being. We'll say, this is the Landlord-Tenant Act, this is this law, this is that law. Well, how did we get that law? And if we get into an honest conversation about the laws being a manifestation of political forces at the time that they are written, then we can start talking about the need for organizing, for meaningful law reform, rather than perpetual, ongoing consultations where everyone can feel like they've been heard and still get no housing, no justice, no income security programs. You know, when we're talking about dealing with the police, you know, one of the favorite souvenirs that people buy in this city are the Mounties. The Mounties were created to put down Native people. So how can you ask Native people to trust the police when through their whole life experience, that state arm has put them down? And the Supreme Court says we don't have a right to housing in a country where you have 6 months of winter. So we need to be talking about the reality of the state and its role in terms of serving class interests, in terms of serving patriarchy. The relationship between the church and state is not broken, as we can see from the residential schools. So I think we need a little bit more honest discussion about the repressive nature of the state, because otherwise, if you don't recognize that you are pushing against a repressive system that was never meant to serve the public, then you will not get anywhere in law reform. In my humble opinion.
So there's a study, well, the SIU actually releases the report every year about the complaints that people put forward to the SIU. The second highest complaint against the SIU, Special Investigations Unit for the police. The second highest complaint against them is sexual assault by police officers. So why would a survivor go to police officers that might have sexually assaulted someone in their community. So we talk about access to justice, we have to also talk about why people might not report, not only because of the legal system, but because of even the system before they get to speak even to a lawyer, even speak to the Crown, has so many barriers. Why we have movements like Black Lives Matter that is saying very clearly that Black people are being killed, that Black people are not being treated with respect. Where we have movements like Access Without Fear, why non-status people and people with precarious status can't access justice when they're experiencing high levels of violence or in a precarious state in their relationships. So I think it speaks to, yes, we have to talk about, if we're going to talk about access justice, we also have to be a movement of people that are pushing up against institutions that are creating so many barriers even before people talk to a lawyer, talk to the so-called criminal justice or justice system.
So I also want to echo what Tim has just said, and I think it speaks to then the other side of the equation. What is the obligation on the part of the players in the system to alleviate, if not eliminate, these conditions that you talk about? So I think it speaks to, for instance, as a lawyer, an obligation on the part of a lawyer when I'm representing the client. Not only should I be cognizant of the issues of my privilege, the issues faced by the client in terms of racism and sexism and so on, but it's also up to me to look at the system and see where the system needs to be challenged and launch challenge where it needs to be done. And obligation on the part of lawyers as an educators or community legal workers as a public legal educators to speak not only about what the law is, but what the law should be, and so on.
It's just a microphone coming from.
I think I can do without it, but I think a very interesting distinction was made, I think by Farrah, that the courts are not anymore courts of justice, but courts of law. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So then the question comes is, since there are so many lawyers here, have you tried saying that in a court to a judge? And if you do that, what kind of reaction do you expect? I mean, I'm just, as a citizen, curious, and maybe I will try it next time, but what do you expect from the judge? Will he punish you for that? Or what kind of reaction do you expect? Or will he say, oh, you're not a lawyer, you don't know law, I mean, whatever it is. How do you feel about that, trying it out in the court? Or has anybody tried it? And why not try it is another question. So.
Yeah, I do think right now for many of us, and I really do think that the current legal system is not a justice system, but then what are the things we're going to give to people that need to use it? And I think that's the thing too, is that we can't just say, I would never want to say to a survivor, you can't, this is not a system you can use, because I want to make sure that we give them all the options available to them. And this is one of the options. And if they want to go through with this option, how can we make it the best possible scenario for you? And really it's sometimes about harm reduction more than anything else. So preparing people for what could happen in the court, making sure that they're aware of the limitations of the court, and being prepared for that, so that we're not just saying that there's going to be this magical wand that will come at the end and spray everything with fairy dust, and the process will feel like justice. And that's why I always ask, like, what does justice look like for you? Because I think for many survivors that I work with, justice can be actually being able to hold that person accountable in other ways. It may be telling your story to the media. It may be telling your story to a friend for the first time. It might be having a family council meeting where the whole family is present for days and having conversations with the family of how do we uproot the family violence that has been in our family for generations because of colonialism, because of racism, because of homophobia. So I think it's thinking about also, if we're going to talk about the criminal justice system or this legal system, but also what are the other forms of justice that people can access, and how do we support those to foster in Canada that actually are going to work for all people involved, especially the most marginalized.